Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Schumacher, and I'm very pleased to be at the Nordic Sustainable Investment Forum conference, and it is a pleasure to be here. So I am currently a lecturer in sustainable finance and ESG at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. And besides that, I'm also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Luxembourg, as well as at the United Nations University based in Tokyo. My research focuses on ESG data, green bonds, sustainability reporting, and everything around, for example, biodiversity indicators. I'm very pleased to be here today and also to introduce some of the topics that are dear to my heart, which is greenwashing. Because if we talk about sustainable finance, one of the key elements that needs to be addressed is what is credible ESG investing and what is credible sustainable finance. And today I will talk about one of the subtopics around greenwashing. Competence greenwashing is sort of a sub-element related to greenwashing, which is usually advertising certain claims or certain performance of financial or from products and services and claiming that they have either environmental or sustainability related benefits, or that they, for example, they have less impact on the environment, but without having substantial data or evidence to prove whether or not these claims are true or not. And that is what we understand around greenwashing. So it's misleading stakeholders, be it the public or civil society or customers, around what your product or your service can actually achieve in terms of environmental or sustainability benefits. Competence greenwashing goes into that direction because it is basically a more person or individual driven element of greenwashing, because with sustainable finance and sustainable investing growing exponentially from year to year, there's recent statistics by Morningstar that said that it achieved growth rates of more than double every year, and it has been growing to more than $1 trillion of assets under management. With those numbers in recent years, that also means that there's a lot of demand for experts in that field. Because now with regulators becoming more active in terms of defining what is sustainability, what is considered green, and what sustainable investments need to, what kind of proof they need to deliver, that also means that you need to have people who implement all these policies and who assure due diligence and compliance with new regulation. And with sustainable finance being sort of at the intersection of sustainability and finance, usually the finance area is very well covered by existing financial experts. However, a lot of banks and financial institutions do not necessarily have the expertise to cover the non-financial elements of sustainable finance, notably, for example, environmental impact measurement, principal adverse impact measurement, or measuring do no significant harm, which are some of the principles recently introduced, for example, by the EU as some of the cornerstones to make sure that sustainable investments actually do have any sustainability or environmental benefits. And that usually, that expertise falls into areas that are not traditionally linked to people with finance or economics backgrounds. They go more into the natural science realm, for example, ecologists, climate scientists, biologists, engineers, people with more traditional backgrounds that would measure, that would make sure that any of these claims that are being made, for example, around forestry, around carbon reductions, that they're actually truthful. And that is where competence greenwashing comes into play, because competence greenwashing is basically suggesting that you have skills that you do not exactly have. And that is something that is very important, because in recent years, there's a lot of like certificates popping up left and right: ESG certificates, sustainable finance certificates, short online courses, short online certificate courses, short sustainability leadership courses, everything that promises to make you an ESG professional, that makes you an ESG an analyst, that makes you a certified sustainable finance professional within a fraction of the time that it usually takes to acquire something that we as society consider to be equivalent to expertise. There's always this saying that to become an expert in something, you need to invest 10,000 hours. Of course, finance professionals do not start from like zero, but it is important to say that anything that promises you to become an expert or to become a professional or to become a specialist in something within, like, say, a few weeks or even over the course of a few hours, that is let's say bold, if not borderline misleading. And then if you as a practitioner or professional then claim to be an expert after completing such a course, that also falls into competence greenwashing, because you basically, without having any prior deep knowledge around sustainability or environmental issues, you now start to claim to be an expert in this field. And of course, the lack of definition, what is an ESG professional, is one of the causes. But now that more and more requirements are coming up and more instances of just general greenwashing are also appearing, for example, some funds in the EU have been found to make a lot of claims, but there was very little documentation or data to back up those claims. Or funds, or for example, investment vehicles still investing in certain sectors that are highly detrimental, or sometimes just the data being just completely wrong, and no one there to actually verify whether or not that data is right or not. Because even if a company gives you, for example, a lot of biodiversity data, if you're not an expert, you would not necessarily know what you're looking at. And how would you be able to evaluate what you're looking at and whether or not that data is correct or not? And that is something that is really important, that expertise and skills, especially non-financial ones, they need to be backed up by actual subject matter experts, because you do not become a subject matter expert in sustainability, the environment, or climate just because of passion or because of awareness. Awareness does not equal competence. And that is something that is very important to know around competence greenwashing. Now, after we established what is competence greenwashing, is what do credible ESG teams look like within financial institutions? And I think that is something that's where the financial sector, not only in terms of the types of products they offer, for example, sustainability funds, green bonds or so, in order for them to also fully implement or integrate anything that comes with ESG, for example, properly monitoring any impact or properly collecting the data across supply chains, across their portfolio holding, across investee companies, you need people who have some of the expertise. And looking at the current market, because there's a high demand for ESG experts, is that very few of them actually have natural science backgrounds. Most of them are just regular people, regular finance people who have been already sometimes a long time within institutions, regular asset managers, regular fund managers, due diligence, even from the legal teams, very often marketing and communications. And they are just then being relabeled into ESG experts without actually having a lot of track records, long-standing track records. Just because you consider yourself to be an ESG expert does not make you an ESG expert. And that is where financial institutions now need to also diversify their teams. Because one of the things that I said in the past is that for sustainable finance to truly function and for ESG investing to truly function, you need finance experts and scientists in the same room, because otherwise you cannot cover the non-financial portion only through, for example, acquiring ESG data from ESG providers, because there's already a lot, or looking at ESG ratings, because there's already many studies that show how faulty that data is, because it is also related to the fact that most of our data comes from the companies themselves. So it's self-assessed, self-reported, often self-verified. And since verification, external verification, third-party verification is very patchy at best and sometimes just absent at worst, that means how much can we trust the data and how much can we actually control whether or not our investments, our sustainability investments, have an impact. So the teams also need to diversify. That does not mean that every finance expert needs to become a natural scientist, but every natural scientist needs to become a finance expert. No, it is to create teams where the finance experts have knowledge or awareness around ESG issues, but you at the same time, you have, for example, if you are setting up, for example, a forest fund, that you will have an actual forest ecologist, for example, in the team that can monitor those things, especially if it's a fund that manages more than several millions or sometimes billions in terms of assets. It just makes sense to have such an expert in the team and not just like, on an ad hoc basis, just like, occasionally monitoring what is going on. So that is where it needs to change. And a good example is one of a large asset manager had set up an ecosystems fund. And some of the things that they were claiming was they want to promote biodiversity, they want to promote, like, for example, healthy ecosystems. And the irony was they had two fund managers and none of the fund managers had any material like ecology, environment, sustainability expertise. They came from traditional finance, and then they're just put in charge of an ecosystems fund. And that is something, one of the developments where I would say that is clearly an issue where the teams are not properly structured, and ultimately the fund is set up for failure. Because, and the dilemma is usually we only find out of the lacking performance years later, because the regulators themselves also do not currently have the capacity to properly monitor those sustainable investment funds. And that is something that also regulators also need to ramp up their capacities. For example, very recently, a few months ago, the European Central Bank hired their first climate scientist. And that is something where it shows the lack of expertise, of granular expertise at this stage. So one of the points that I mentioned was that, for example, there was an ecosystems fund where the two fund managers did not have any material expertise related to ecosystems or biodiversity. And that is where the risks actually are, because at some point there's this concept of stranded assets, that at some point you find yourself with assets that are technically in existence, but they are devoid of any substance. And that is what a lot of regulators, for example, the Dutch and the Netherlands, the Dutch and the French regulators recently were looking at sustainable investment funds under the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, Articles 8 and 9. And they found out that for many of them, the claims did not live up to the promises. And more instances are now also coming out. So there's several studies by certain NGOs that looked at investment funds, for example, even domiciled in Luxembourg, in Switzerland, or all over Europe. Some of those NGOs being Greenpeace, 2 Degree Investing Initiative, or, for example, Influence Map. And they found that, they found the same thing that a lot of regulators found as well. A lot of these claims, they cannot be backed up. So at worst, you might find yourself with a fund that ultimately needs to be relabeled. So it would lose its sustainability status, for example, under the SFDR, or you would find yourself with green bonds that ultimately would lose their green status because they do not qualify anymore if, for example, any of the proceeds are improperly managed by teams that do not really know, for example, in terms of impact investments, do not really know how to properly monitor impact, even though there's a lot of frameworks and there's a lot of guidelines and a lot of standards that are out there. You still need qualified people to properly utilize those standards. I could probably watch, to give a good example, I could probably watch a very detailed guide on how to perform neurosurgery, but I would probably and very likely and most definitely fail because I am not a trained neurosurgeon. So I could probably watch a million YouTube videos. I could probably watch a million manuals that would technically tell me, but if those guides often make only sense to people with the proper expertise on how to utilize them. The same is, for example, a manual on how to fly an Airbus 380. I can read the whole thing, but in the end, I'm still not a trained pilot. So there's one thing of having a lot of guidelines and guidance documents and standards out there, which is very useful. However, you still need people with the proper technical expertise to be able to interpret said data. And that is extremely important. If you want subject matter expertise, then there's simply no short route. There's no easy route. That is the unfortunate conclusion that I have to make, is to get subject matter expertise, there's never an easy route, because if there's an easy route, then it's not necessarily expertise, because expertise is acquired over years. For example, in terms of ecology or climate, that is usually through deep research, through deep field work, expertise in the field. So that is something that every practitioner who wants to start or continue the ESG journey or the sustainable finance journeys, that they need to consider. That there is no easy route to deep ESG or sustainability subject matter expertise. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure to be a part of this conference, and I hope that you could learn a little bit more about competence greenwashing. And if you do have any questions, please do reach out to me. Find me on the social networks like LinkedIn, and happy to discuss further if there's any questions or comments. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic conference.